All right, welcome everyone. We are so excited to kick off the first session of Nucleate's Inside Venture Capital series with all of you. Today, we will be focused on the foundations of venture capital and early stage financing. This series is a part of the Nucleate Path Initiative, our professional advancement and training hub, where we host educational programming in various life science career sectors. My name is Tamara Jafar, and I am the director of the Inside VC series and a computational neuroscience PhD student. I just want to start by saying a huge thank you to all of you for being here today and to our incredible Path team at Nucleate for helping make this session possible. We're also incredibly thankful and grateful for our speaker today, Dr. Matt Cohen, for taking time out of his very busy schedule to join us. He's done outstanding work in the venture space, and we are truly honored to have him here to share his insights. This session and the ones to follow are all about demystifying how venture capital really works, especially for researchers and entrepreneurs in biotech and academia who are thinking about starting or investing in companies that bring scientific discoveries to market. Before we begin, just a few quick announcements. We have several more panels coming up over the next few months, featuring additional speakers and topics, including startup formation, due diligence, and fundraising mechanics. Recordings of all of our sessions will be posted afterwards on our YouTube account, and you can find registration links for upcoming events on our LinkedIn page, as well as our Luma Global Events calendar. Everything will be posted there, so you can sign up and get the Zoom link so you can access some more great content from our Inside series. Now, I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Matt Cohen, Managing Partner for Life Sciences at Osage University Partners. Dr. Cohen has spent the last 12 years at OUP, where he helps bridge the gap between academia and venture investment by supporting university spinouts across the life sciences, software, and engineering sectors. He also earned his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, and his work at OUP has played a major role in shaping how research institutions translate discoveries into successful venture-backed startups. So, Dr. Matt Cohen, please take it away.
Thanks, Tamara. Appreciate the introduction. I'm just going to pull up slides. All right, full screen mode. Great. So Tamara reviewed all of this, one of the managing partners at OUP and co-manage our life science investing activities. 95% plus of what we do here is therapeutic, so that's where I spend most of my time. As Tamara said, PhD in bioimmunology from Penn, spent some time at LEK in their New York office, and have been at OUP now for the last 12 years. And thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk today. This is a little bit about the fund and what we do. We do focus on investing in startups based on university research. I should add, though, that we have the ability to invest in anything from anywhere. So it's not only university startups, but that is where we focus. As Tamara mentioned, we do more than life science. We do everything coming from universities. I don't. I just do life sciences, but we have a team that does what we call tech or physical sciences as well. And we've been doing this a long time. We've raised 4 funds, more than $800 million under management. And as Tamara mentioned, this is being recorded, and so you'll be able to go back and watch it through Nucleate. We also have a YouTube page where we record a very large majority of our webinars on all sorts of topics in venture capital. So, if you have a topic here that we want to dive into more, we probably have a recorded webinar on that as well. And so what I'm going to do today is, since I'm the first presenter in this series of sessions, is give an overview. And a lot of the topics we're going to touch on, you're going to go into a lot more depth on in future webinars. So we're going to stay pretty high level. We will go deep in some areas, but within all of these, I think you're going to go even deeper with some of the other speakers throughout the year. So let's just start, though, with how is a venture fund structured? How is it organized? Who are the key people? Just to give you a sense of, who are they? What are they? Where's the money coming from? And it helps you start to think about how and why VCs make the decisions that they might make. So the general partners, or GPs, are the venture capitalists. Those are the folks that are raising money from LPs or limited partners, manage the money, make the investment decisions. And the GPs are assisted by a whole team of folks sometimes additional partners, principals. Sometimes they use, vice president title, associates, analysts who do what we call heavy lifting, but it's sourcing, due diligence. Sometimes they take board seats, especially at the principal or above level. So the GPs and the team make up the players at the venture capital fund. The VC fund itself is basically the capital is raised from, as I said, limited partners or the investors, based on that VC fund pitching what their strategy is, what the expertise they have, the track record of how good of an investor they are in terms of how well do they make their investors money. And oftentimes, to be able to raise a fund could take months, it could take a year, could take more than a year. The limited partners themselves, those are the ones that actually provide the capital to the VC fund. So it's a common misconception that the VCs themselves put up, their own money. It's not all their own money. They usually often do put up some and invest in the fund, but frequently it's 1% of the total size of the venture fund. So it's quite small. Most of the capital comes from these limited partners. So who are they? Typically those could be insurance companies, endowments, pensions, high net worth individuals, individual investors, family offices. It can be quite broad. Um, and so for those LPs, investing in venture capital funds is only a very small sliver of how they manage their overall portfolio. It tends to only be 5 to 10% of their overall portfolio is allocated to what they call alternative investments. So again, different than, say, public market investing. And that of that 5 to 10%, a small sliver of that is venture capital. And venture capital is considered illiquid because they can't pull out their money whenever they want. Once they commit to investing in the fund, a lot of these companies are private. So once we invest, we can't get our money out of private companies. And so for our LPs, that money is considered illiquid. It's considered a risky asset class, but it is considered a class that has higher return potential, for example, than investing in the S&P 500. So kind of moving on here. So how are VCs compensated and what are the economics of the fund? So one thing is the VC fund needs money to operate. You need to be able to pay people. You need to pay the employees. You often need an office. You need to pay space. You need to pay for travel. So how do VCs sort of get a revenue stream when all the money that they raise is going out? It's not just staying in, and that's by collecting a management fee. So often this is a percentage of the total capital that's committed to the fund. When I say committed, a reason why I say that is when a VC raises money, let's say they raise a $100 million fund, the LPs don't give the VCs $100 million all up front. As we want to make investments, we call capital. So we will send them an email, a formal letter that says, hey, we're calling 5% of your commitment. So if their commitment was, overall was 100 million, we're calling, $5 million, and that's split up amongst lots of LPs. So we don't get it all at once, but we do collect a fee on the total amount of the total commitment for the fund. So and that's per year. So as we say here, if $100 million fund, and the fees are 2 to 2.5%, it's $2 to $2.5 million per year. That's generally the operating budget of the fund. So how else do VCs get paid, and what's the upside? Well, that's what we call carried interest. So LPs will receive their returns until 100% of committed capital is returned. So let's say we have a $100 million fund, we invest that all out, and then we start getting exits. So money starts coming back. The first 100 million that comes back has to all go to your LPs. They get their full amount of their principal back first. After that, that's considered profit, anything above their principal. And 80% of that profit goes to the LPs, and 20% of that profit goes to the GPs. And the GPs then also give portions of the carried interest to their team. Associates, principals, VPs, all those people we talk, they also get a little piece of that. So everyone sort of tries to share in what is the upside in success. If you're unsuccessful and you don't return the principal to your LPs, you don't get any of this. There's no carried interest. So you have to have some amount of success to see any of this. All right, so what is the typical VC fund life cycle? And this is really important, and we'll talk more about this in terms of when you're out raising capital and talking to VCs, understanding where they are in their life cycle. So funds have 10-year lives. You can often extend those 2 years, and after which, those funds are liquidated. So investments are typically made between years 1 and 4. You technically have 5 years to make new investments in companies that you haven't previously invested in. And that's called the investment period. And then the next 5 years or 7 years, if you have the 2 1-year extensions, you can spend either making follow-on investments in the existing portfolio companies you've already invested in, and you're also trying to mature and exit those companies over that time period. So if you are, let's say, a VC fund in year 4 or year 5 of your investment period, and someone comes to you and says, hey, I've got this really great idea. We're an early stage, pre-seed stage startup, and we think it's, going to take about 8 years to get to an exit. And I'm already in year 4 of the fund. Well, you're really pushing the boundary of how long I have to try to liquidate that fund. So, maybe that really, really early stage company, if I'm in year 4 of the fund, isn't a great fit for the fund at this stage of the fund's life cycle. So as an entrepreneur, it's really important to understand, if you're raising capital, kind of where are these funds in their life cycle? When might they raise their next fund? Because if they're early in year 1 of their life cycle, that may be a better time to pitch an idea or a company that might take 8, 10, 12 years to get to an exit. So typically, funds want to reserve capital. So I mentioned making follow-on investments into the existing portfolio companies. So a lot of funds will typically reserve $2 to $3 for every $1 they invest to be able to participate in future rounds of investment in the company. So if I invest $2 million in an early round, I might want to reserve $4 to $6 million for the next round. If I invest in a seed, I want to reserve for the Series A, the Series B, the Series C. If I believe in the company, I want to keep investing more capital into it, sometimes at higher prices, sometimes at flat prices to the prior round, sometimes at lower prices to the prior round, depending on progress and market conditions. But I want to be able to protect my investment. Additionally, in the market we're in today for biotech, oftentimes it's really hard to raise money, and we'll talk more about that. And so sometimes the inside investors, that means the investors who are already invested in the company, are asked to do the entire amount of the next round. And if an investor says, oh, wow, I don't really have any reserves for this, well, the other investors can say, well, if you don't participate, we're going to wipe you out. We're going to just eliminate all of your equity and kill the value in that. And so you want to make sure you have reserves in case that were to happen, because you don't, if the company's doing okay, you don't want to get wiped out. So typically funds are going to, raise additional funds, once you've kind of committed and reserved about 80% of the total capital in the fund. So every, 3, 4, 5 years, venture funds are going back out to the market, to their LPs, and trying to raise the next fund so that they have, again, capital for additional investments. And you never want to be out of the market. You always want to be able to say, yeah, we're investing. You wouldn't want to say, we're not investing right now. We have to raise our next fund. You kind of always want to be in that market. There's also additional motivation, because for every new fund you raise, you collect additional fees, and you have greater upside for carried interest. So hopefully this is helpful in sort of starting to explain how a VC fund works, what are the motivators, how do VC funds get paid, and sort of why they might start to make decisions that they make. All right, so in the next section, we're going to talk about now more on the company side and capital formation for startups. So this is a key slide. This is the life cycle of capital formation. And actually, we're going to start at the bottom of this slide. So when you're a new startup, where you start, and essentially on the right says function, you're a science project. You're coming out of a research lab. You're not really a company yet. And so where do you go for funding? Whether you're still in the lab or you're trying to make progress, in grants, right? Grants are a very typical place to get funded. But let's say you've kind of done enough with grants, you've got enough data, you think there's really something there to this, and you want to form a company. So you form an entity, you contact an attorney, and they legally form the entity in the state of Delaware. And now you're a pre-funded startup. You're a startup, but you haven't raised any equity capital. Could it still apply for grants from the government, like a small business grant? But you start to think, wow, we really need to raise more money than that. And so where's the first place you go? Well, A lot of people go to their friends and family. Those are people that they know well, and frankly, that, they trust and trust you. So, you might raise a couple 100,000, you might raise 500,000, you might raise $1 million, but it's really one of the first places that folks go. And that's really just to get some, initial data, maybe get a team together, get a plan together, maybe get the license done to get the IP from the university. And so once you're done that, well, where do you go next? And so the next stage of capital, really, you're raising to try to get proof of concept, whether that's an in vivo animal study to get proof of concept or something else, depending on what it is you're doing. You need to get proof of concept before, VCs may take a really hard look. Some VCs like to invest really, really early, but if you want to try to raise, 20, 30, 40, $50 million, which, for a therapeutics company, you're going to ultimately need to raise at least that, if not more, you have to have some proof of concept. And so where do you go for that? You might go to some seed stage VCs, and those do exist, but other places, including angels and accelerators, are also really good places to go. And so we have examples here like Y Combinator, and some other golden seeds, a typical angel network. So angels doesn't just mean, an individual with a lot of money. It can also be a network of angels who often invest together. Venture philanthropy is also an awesome place to go for investment, and some of these have really done. These organizations have done really well. Places like the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation have had very large royalty streams from CF drugs that have been approved and have tons of capital to invest in projects that are near and dear to their hearts. Another one being, their Michael J. Fox Foundation, as we show. So multiple places to go, not just VCs. And really, you're trying to scrap together enough money to get your POC data. Or so once you have your POC data, now it's time to scale. Hey, now it's time to go to VCs, raise real capital. If you're a therapeutics company, you're going to need a lot of money. And so, in this market, at least, you're trying to often raise to get clinical proof of concept. Get your drug to the clinic, get phase 1 data. That might be, depending on the therapeutic area, healthy volunteer data. That may or may not be proof of concept. If you can get target engagement data, great. If you can't, you might need to go into patients. So you got to figure out how to do that. And you might need to raise enough money to get into patients and show some human, patient clinical data. And so, okay, so, you've done that, you raise large amounts of money, get your human proof of concept. And so where do you go from there? You could go public and raise capital in the public markets and keep going. But you could also say, hey, we think this is a good time for an exit. And so you go to strategics. You say, all right, we're going to do M&A, or we're going to do a partnership. And those strategics have very large amounts of money. And what do? And they do really well, especially pharma companies, is commercialize medicines. And so they can provide that late stage capital, do late stage clinical development, and ultimately hopefully get the drug approved and onto the market. So so we're talking about what's the probability that a startup can raise VC capital at all. So the first point to make is that most startups, including most academic originated startups, do not require and will not ever get institutional venture capital. The vast majority of startups don't need it for a variety of reasons, sometimes being the market they're going after just isn't large enough for VCs to be interested. If you raise $100 million and your market is $20 million revenue a year, I mean, to need $100 million to get there doesn't really make a lot of sense. So most startups, that doesn't mean they're bad businesses. Some of them are fantastic businesses, but they're not appropriate for raising VC money. You don't even need that much money to make them great businesses. But VCs do look at hundreds of businesses and startups just to make one investment. And we're going to go into the numbers in more detail in a second. And at OUP, through our university partner network, which is, now over 100 institutions that we work with, we actively track 14,000 private companies. Yet we'll only make about 40 investments in a fund. So of all the companies we have in our universe that we could, quote unquote, consider, less than 1% of those are going to get funded by us. And that's generally true for the industry at large. So here are the numbers laid out. So here are at the top, all the companies considered. About a third of those, a little less than a third, will get to meet, VCs will actually meet with management. Oh, and that includes associates, principals, whomever on the team. 10% of those will get reviewed with the partners or the general partners. 5% of those, you'll actually go into due diligence. Less than 2% of those will get offered a term sheet. And ultimately, only a percentage of those close. And so what you end up with is less than 1% of companies that start at the top actually ever close a deal with a VC fund. So it's hard. Bottom line is it's hard. It's not easy. And there's a lot of companies for VCs to consider, and only a small fraction of them will be successful. And I know you're going to have a session with someone else to talk about pitching. We'll cover that a little bit just on one slide today, just as a high level. But it's the reason why getting really good at pitching an idea is so important. You have to find ways to stand out. So another really key thing, in addition to, we talked about VC funds have life cycles, and where are they in their life cycle, is VC funds invest at different stages. Not every fund invests in early stage company formation or early preclinical therapeutics companies. Not every fund invests in late clinical stage companies, and some funds invest across everything. So this is a snapshot of, kind of taking at the top, therapeutics companies, and then some funds invest in all life sciences, therapeutics, devices, diagnostics, tools. And the bottom line and the takeaway here is that you got to know your investor. You got to know which ones invest early, which ones invest late, which ones invest everywhere. You have the crossover investor box there. We have this dotted arrow that goes to the left because sometimes they start investing earlier. In the market we're in now, they primarily want to invest later, so that can fluctuate. So it's not something you can learn once and say, I think I know it, and 5 years later assume it's the same. This changes all of the time. VC funds often change strategy depending on market conditions. And of course, these are just examples. There are way more VCs than this, and there's always nuances to their strategies. So one of the things Tamara asked me to present too was, well, what's going on in the market today? What are the conditions like? And basically what we see here in the data, and these are private financings across biopharma, private companies, health tech, diagnostics tools, and devices, is that we had a huge pandemic boom. So 2020, 2021, and then fell off in the second half of 2022 was this big boom of infusion of capital into life science companies. And as you can see, 2023 and 2024 has been really a normalization of what we saw prior to the pandemic. Between 22 and 23, huge drop-offs in all of these sectors, and now perhaps some recovery that we saw in 2024 from what things looked like in 2022 and 2023, which is positive. And I think we all feel that. I feel that things are looking a little bit better. But there was a really interesting piece of data that came out today in an article. So I just threw this in here today, which was that, and this was an article in Biospace showing the last 5 years of biotech venture capital deal flow. And you'll see the same pandemic boom, 2020, 2021, and this quick drop off, 2022, 2023. There was that recovery that we showed on the last slide in 2024. And here's, partial year of 2025, which is looking, sort of like 23, 24. Does it come in a little lower? Does it come in a little higher? Not sure yet. But the real takeaway is deal count. Massive drop off in 2025 on deal count. So what does this imply? It implies that fewer companies are getting more of the dollars. The VCs are more willing to fund larger rounds to make sure these companies can get further along. So that could either mean funding earlier stage companies with larger rounds to be sure that they can get through clinical proof of concept or beyond. Or it could be VCs are mostly focused on later clinical stage companies and putting larger rounds together for those so that, again, they can get through phase 2s, phase 3s, and perhaps even commercial launches. So this is the market. This is what's going on, particularly in biotech and therapeutics. And so there really is a pretty precipitous fall off in capital for early stage startups. The other part of this article talks about money for sort of preclinical therapeutics companies, seed stage, or Series A, and that capital really has fallen off quite a bit. And so there is, definitely a need for VCs to come back. The good news to that stage, the good news is that this is all very cyclical. Venture is extremely cyclical, and we will see in the next couple of years things shift. VC funds will go early again. Crossover investors will go early again. Capital will flow back. Interest rates will come down, which will promote that. So, we don't have to despair. I don't think this is going to be a 10-year cycle. This, I think a couple of years, and we'll probably see the cycle start to turn. So I just mentioned pitching, and I'm going to give you a high level overview. I know you're going to get a much deeper, in-depth talk on how to pitch VCs. But the first thing to understand is we get a lot of pitch decks. And so strong first impression is vital. Whether you have a first interaction as a phone call, or it's just you're sending a pitch deck, or you're just sending an executive summary, it's got to be clear, it's got to be concise, and it's got to be compelling. Start with who you are. That's my personal preference. I see decks that say who you are at the very end of the deck. You can do that, but I like to know who I'm talking to before they tell me what it is they're doing. You have to have compelling data that justifies why you're excited, why you made a commitment of your time. You might spend the next 5 years of your life on this. Our number one most precious thing in our lives is time. And so if you're going to spend 5 years on it, why? Tell me why. And that means data. So oftentimes people get confused. They think data is confidential. It's not. The data itself is not confidential. Sometimes how you generated that data might be confidential. So if you have to tell me target X or you have to tell me compound Y, that's fine. But what data, what model and what disease and what data do you generate using compound X or perturbing target Y? That's not confidential. And you often need to show data to convince people that you have any and convince people that you have something to be excited about. Sometimes you have to kind of highlight the addressable market for people. If it's an obscure indication or rare disease, you probably need to do more of this. If it's something VCs know really, really well, it's more common, you probably need to do a lot less of this. Sometimes you want to say, hey, what are the comparable companies? What is our competition? Some companies might be ahead and have generated tremendous value, may have been acquired. And that's evidence that someone cares. Pharma would want to buy something. How much should they buy it for? Again, if you have something better, that's evidence that, again, the market cares. And what have you done to date? What have you accomplished from a funding perspective? Have you put a team together? What does all that look like? And then what are you going to do with the money? You say, I want to raise $5 million. What are you going to do it? What's the use of those proceeds? So how do you get in front of people? The number one way is to leverage trusted connections. Try to get an introduction by, someone the VC fund knows or trusts, whether it's an advisor or a friend. When you're first forming a new company, finding experienced advisors is absolutely critical. And it's not just to advise you on, well, what should I do? Like, what are my next steps? How do I build a company? It's also for their relationships and their connections. If they believe in what you're doing, they're more likely to, reach out to their network and say, hey, I want to show you something that I really believe in. I think you're going to like. If you don't have trusted friends or advisors who know VCs, totally understandable, makes total sense. You can cold email folks, absolutely cold email people. VCs will respond. Not everyone will. Some won't. And some, if they're not interested, they just won't respond. And, take that for what it is. Maybe you sent an email, you did one follow-up, you didn't get a response. Fine. They're most likely not interested. Just let it go. But you'll definitely get some responses, whether it's a LinkedIn reach out or an email reach out. I often respond if I'm interested and say, hey, great, sounds interesting, send me a deck. Or if you already sent me a deck, oh, this looks interesting, let's set up an introductory call. So, don't feel like you can't do that, but often going through someone, that they might know is the better approach. Again, not going to belabor going through each one of these. These are, say, like the key slides or sections of slides you need in a deck. We talked about a lot of this. You need to say who you are, the key data, competition, and a whole bunch of things. Not everything goes into every pitch, but these are the basic main things. And you're going to have I think, a webinar on this topic in more depth. So I love this slide. What are the practical suggestions for pitching? There's the technical suggestions, but what do you just want to do and think about when you're pitching people? Don't hide anything substantive, because it won't stay hidden for long. People you're pitching are smart. They'll quickly get up to speed in your area. You're going to know way more than them at the start, but they're going to get up to speed. They're going to call people they know that might know the area. And if you hide something, or you don't share something that's truly critical, you're going to lose credibility. If there's a competitor doing exactly what you do that's 4 years ahead, and it doesn't look like you have any way to be different, and you don't mention them during your pitch, and then the VC fund goes and Googles around and finds that, you're going to lose credibility really fast. Follow good presentation guidelines. Again, be clear, concise, compelling. Don't overpopulate, overcomplicate slides. It is critical when you send a slide deck that someone can just read it without your voiceover and know exactly it is what you're doing. If you have a data slide, and it's a mouse model, you got to put, somewhere on there, or a prior slide, what was the protocol? Like, what'd you do? How many times did you inject? What was the, how frequently did you inject? When did you take measurements? All the kind of key things. What was the dose? What were the controls? You got to put enough in there if you just send somebody something that they can interpret it, and assume the people you're sending it to are like you, scientists. Always pause to allow for questions. I recognize I'm not doing that. So if anyone uses the question box tomorrow, please, jump in and stop me, and feel free to just, answer one of those questions, or ask one of those questions of me, and I'll try to answer. But when you're pitching, you should pause to allow for questions. And we will do Q&A at the end, so we can also save them if folks want to save them for the end. When you don't know an answer, just say, I don't know. Anyone who's done a PhD, went through prelims, and if you finished your PhD, you've gone through your defense. I think everyone is coached to know to say, I don't know. When you don't know, don't fake it, don't make it up. Same when pitching investors. Don't make it up. But you can say, hey, I'll get back to you. I don't have that at the tip of my fingers, but I think we have that. Let me go back. I'll follow up. That's a great answer. Or I don't know, I haven't thought about that. Let me think about that for a little while. It's an interesting question. I'll follow up with you by email to try to answer it. That's a great way to handle stuff that you just frankly don't know in the moment. But always remember, again, you're the expert on this company, or you should be the expert on the company and the technology, but it's the first time, or maybe the first time, an investor's seeing it. So expect dumb questions, and be patient with answering our dumb questions. But you'll notice that an investor who's interested is going to get up to speed pretty quickly. And so here are some lessons learned for targeting investors. One, you have to know their sector. Don't pitch them something that they don't do. Don't pitch them a stage they don't do. And understand, do they have money available to invest? Unless you've done this before and you've had a lot of entrepreneurial success, it's hard, and it could be grueling and a long process. Even for the VCs, when we go raise money from our LPs, it's a grueling and long process. I have to maybe touch hundreds of LPs to find one that's interested in investing in the fund. So it's hard for us. Everyone has a boss. And so just know it's hard. You're going to get a lot of no's. Be prepared for it. And you're going to get no's more often than you say yes. If you tell me, oh, I talked to 20 VCs and no one's interested, for my biotech therapeutics company, I would say, there are probably close to 170 biotech-focused venture capital funds. You need to touch all 170, not 20. So, it's long, it's hard, and it takes time. People often ask, well, what can I use a bank, or what sometimes, they're called private placement agents that can help me fundraise. They can connect me to investors. They can arrange meetings. But the reality is, I want to work directly with the management team or the founders. I have no interest in interacting with the bank, around your idea. So, it can be helpful. You can run an efficient process. It can help you identify people. But first it costs money, like you have to pay them out of your proceeds. And two, you got to be really, really involved because I want to spend most of my time with you. I don't want to spend most of my time with, the bank that's helping you. All right, so let's talk a little bit about due diligence. Again, I think another topic you're going to have. Um, Bottom line is it, is this a good idea? Is this a good investment? Is this the best team to do this? And is this the right time for me to invest? So those are all the things I'm going to be asking and thinking about. And there's a disconnect. Entrepreneurs, an entrepreneur's trying to get to yes. They want me to say yes. Investors, we're trying to get to no as fast as we possibly can. Again, I got a triage. I get hundreds of things, so I can't spend a ton of time on everything. So my job is to get to know super, super fast, and so that I can move on to the next thing. Whereas entrepreneurs are trying to get me to say yes. The key is if I can't find a good reason to say no, my brain flips. Now I start to flip into, well, now I'm trying to find reasons to say yes. So once I can have no more reasons to say no, I'm now aligned with the entrepreneur and I'm trying to find ways to say yes and get my partners to say yes. So I love this slide. Again, it comes from this source, How Do Venture Capitalists Make Decisions? And basically surveyed industry players to ask, well, what are the factors that contribute to a successful investment? And all sectors is on the left, and we break out just life science on the right, and you'll see the largest thing that drives success, the largest bucket is the team. Team is absolutely critical. For life sciences, you'll see that technology plays a much larger role in non-life science sectors. I think we all know that fundamentally, that life science and biotech's really hard. There's a lot of failure, and that's just science, and that's okay, as long as we took the right shot on goal. So what do folks think if we ask the question differently? What are the factors contributing to unsuccessful investments? How do you think this changes? And I know it's rhetorical and nobody can answer, but going to the next slide, here are the failed investments. No surprise, team is still super duper critical and often is the reason for why companies fail. So team is the reason why people say that's why that company succeeded. And team is also the reason why a lot of people say companies fail. So again, team, absolutely critical to the due diligence process. In life sciences, technology, as we just said, huge factor on whether or not something's successful or not, and we can't always predict biology. So for our fund, team is critical. On the tech side, they focus on market opportunity. On the life science side, we focus on the science and preclinical and clinical data more than any of those buckets underneath at the bottom. So those top two things are by far the most important parts of our due diligence. Everything at the bottom, nice to have. So if you think, oh, I'm going to share a lot about my IP on my first call with a VC, just know we don't care. It's like we'll take your word for it. You have IP, great. At the end of our due diligence process, if everything else checks out, we'll do a deeper dive into IP and make sure like you didn't make stuff up. But it's not the first thing we want to talk about. Here's an example of different questions. So especially on team, have you done it before? Have you been successful doing it? Do you have the right skills? What skills do you lack? Are you surrounding yourself with people that have those skills that are complementary? There's questions about, is it the right plan? And then frankly, are these easy people to work with? Life's too short to work with people you don't want to work with. Investing in a company and working with a management team, can be longer. It's like a marriage, right? It can last. In fact, it can last longer than some marriages last. So, this is you really are, marrying someone and you're going to be in it with them for the long haul. So you want to work with people you actually like. And, excuse my language, but, we and a lot of VCs kind of have a no asshole rule. So, we don't want to work with people like that. It's not fun, even if you have the greatest idea in the world. And we do reference calls. We will check people out, find out about them, what they were like to work with, and often background checks as well. We'll review the capital structure for the company. What's the cap table look like? You're going to have a whole session on cap tables. I'm not going to go into it, but here are the kind of questions we might ask about the capital structure. Who's in it? Who are the existing investors? What's the purpose? And again, clean, straightforward is what's critical. Um, there's this belief. So we're going to talk about valuation just for 2 slides. Everyone always wants to know, like, how do VCs value companies? How do we do valuations? How do we decide what you're worth? There's this misconception that VCs want the absolute lowest valuation possible and entrepreneurs want the absolute highest valuation possible. That's just frankly not true. We want things to be very, very reasonable. We want, just lost the, go back to, okay. We want things to be um, low enough because we want to inspire, incentivize entrepreneurs. If it's too low, that's demoralizing and we take too much of the company and they don't have enough incentive and skin in the game. And entrepreneurs want a reasonable valuation because they want to set reasonable milestones. You don't want to raise a friends and family round at a really high valuation, have a VC come into the next round at a lower valuation, and tell your friends and family that, oh, I'm sorry, I raised money from you and I overcharged you, essentially. That's not a fun conversation to have with your friends or your family. So again, you want to set reasonable valuations so that when you accomplish your milestones and you hit them, that the next round is at a higher valuation, not a lower one. So everyone really should want to set what are reasonable milestones. And so how do we kind of figure out what the valuation is? And my favorite approach is a heuristic where you work backwards. So the basis of working backwards is understanding that VCs need to make a return on our investment. And for an early stage company that's high risk, we need somewhere between a 5 to 10x multiple on our investment. And that's based on the fact that most of our investments fail or maybe we get our money back. So we need the winners to drive enough of a return so that the overall fund across all of our investments is attractive of a return for our investors. We beat the S&P, 12% a year return or 10% a year return, and we're in that sort of low to mid 20% per year returns on an IRR basis. So the top is showing that if you believe your company in success is worth $200 million and we work backwards, your pre-money valuation today, and assuming, you need $10 million to get there, can only be 10 to 30. If you're more than that, I can't get to my 5 to 10. If you tell me your company's worth 50 million and you're worth 200 in success and you need 10 million bucks to get there, 5 to 10x, I can't get it, and it just doesn't make sense. This is super simplified. It's a heuristic, but if you can agree with your investor on what you are worth in success and work backwards using that 5 to 10x heuristic, you can usually get to a number that both sides can at least a range that both sides can start to think about in terms of what you're worth today. We do investment memos. That's kind of how we summarize our document. So when you're going through due diligence with a VC, know that the questions they're asking and the answers are going to end up in a memo. And the memo is so that they can pitch their partners to convince their partners to vote yes on a deal. So when you get all those questions, try not to get, overwhelmed, flustered, annoyed. Why are they asking me all these things? Why do they need all this detail? It seems like overkill. Just know that it's not going into the air, right? It's not going into the ether. They're actually creating a document internally to be able to pitch the rest of their fund. And it's going to have all these different things. They're trying to, uncover red flags that require additional diligence. And that allows their whole team to raise objections, ask questions, so that they can go back and follow up and dig in deeper onto certain topics. And it's a work in progress document. It's constantly being updated. Analysts, associates, principals, they're all working on it. And ultimately, it goes to the investment committee at the fund to decide yes or no on an investment. And the final step at the bottom is the company will be asked to present to the investment committee, who's likely already read the memo and will focus in on certain questions on that call. So the last slide here in the talk, before we can take questions, is simply crossing the finish line. So although it is variable from firm to firm, the last step, I guess, as I said, involves presenting the investment memo to the investment committee. That'll be a select group of senior partners. Oftentimes, the rest of the team might join that call as well. And it's an opportunity for everyone who haven't been as closely involved to ask those questions, get comfortable with the investment, and honestly, decide, is this team worth backing? So again, first impression, again, is going to be critical. And so if the VC likes it, gets through the investment committee, they'll submit a term sheet. If they haven't already done that, you'll negotiate that. Um, Once it's negotiated and signed, supporting documentation gets drafted by the attorneys. You negotiate any remaining terms, final signatures are done, and wire the money. So that's sort of that last step of the process, from going from the very beginning, reaching out to folks, all the way through having capital wired to your company. So that's it. I know I went through that very quickly, 30 slides, but wanted to make sure we save time for questions. This is us. I'm going to stop sharing and happy to take questions.
Amazing. Thank you so, so much, Matt. That was a wonderful first presentation. I think the rest of our speakers are gonna have to live up to that. So we have a bunch of questions in the chat. I'm gonna start off with the ones that had the most upvotes. So the first question is, what percentage of newly approved drugs are discovered in large biopharma companies versus licensed from startups? What percentage of revenues come from in licensed drug candidates, and what is the impact of the upcoming patent cliffs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm going to start with taking my own advice and say, I don't know exactly. I haven't looked at it in a while, so I don't know what the updated numbers are. But my sense, and I'll just kind of tell you, like, kind of shooting from the hip a little bit, my sense of what it is today is somewhere between 50 and 70% of newly approved drugs, maybe a little bit more, come from outside of large pharma's organization. Let's say mid to large pharma, mid-sized biotech to large pharma, um, within their own R&D organizations. So that is to say, a lot. A lot of new drugs come from outside of those organizations. Um, Most of the larger pharma companies have cut and backed off from doing early stage research and science. But just remember, it takes a village, right? A startup might be able to get a drug to, mid-stage clinical studies, but may not be able to take it through, pivotal clinical trials, and may not especially take it through commercialization. So it takes a village of people, companies, experts to get something from, initial biological discovery in a research lab all the way through getting drugs to patients. And then the other question was revenue. Like, where's revenue coming from, and what's the impact of impending patent cliffs? Huge impact for impending patent cliffs. Huge, huge problem, honestly. Some big pharma companies are going to be more impacted than others, but between now and the end of the decade, um, certain companies, Merck has huge upcoming issues with Keytruda, BMS likewise with Opdivo. These were huge revenue drivers for them, and you know, could have major impact in terms of patent cliffs that are coming up. Um, so where are they going to fill their revenue streams from? I think M&A is going to be a huge place for that. I don't think they have enough in their pipelines to fill it when you consider the size of the opportunities of some of them, and also in the pipelines, as well as, attrition. You have to account for attrition. Not everything's going to make it. So I think there's a huge belief that more and more M&A is on the horizon. Um, Anecdotally, from all of my interactions with pharma companies and business development, groups within them, they are hunting, they are searching. Some are looking for later stage assets, but some are looking for things that are, frankly, 12 months before they're even in the clinic. So there are large pharma companies, BD groups, hunting for things that are preclinical.
Amazing, thank you. Our next question is tips on navigating VC when coming directly from academia. What are common pitfalls and things to avoid and not get taken advantage of?
Yeah. So we have webinars on our YouTube channel about this. So if you want more depth, head there, look for topics related to this topic. It's a great question. Common pitfall for startups coming from academia, especially when there's no team yet and you're like pre-company formation. And so who's pitching? PIs, maybe you have a grad student or a postdoc on the call with the PI, is, don't focus on things you don't know. Don't try to become jack of all trades, expert on everything. You know the science, you know the data. We're not going to fault you for not knowing every in and out about the market, or how to sort of take a drug from, a small molecule from hit to lead all the way through, IND submission. We get it. You know your area, and that's fine. I think what's critical though, and the pitfall that I often see folks fall into is not understanding your program in the context of the broader market. And what I mean by that is often folks compare their, let's say, drug or potential drug to approved medicines. But that's not really all you're competing with. You're also going to be competing with drugs that are in clinical trials. In that indication, you're going to be competing with drugs that are in preclinical development, other mechanism of action, other modalities, within a given clinical indication. So if you don't understand how your drug might fit in, how it might be used in combination, all of those things, oftentimes you design the wrong experiments because you're not really able to properly think through how do we differentiate, or how might we differentiate from those other approaches. So that is a very common pitfall. And it was also asked, well, I don't want to get taken advantage of, which totally agree with you. The tech transfer office at your institution is your friend on that. They're there to be sure you're not taken advantage of. Go to them, seek their advice. We work really closely with all those folks. They're great. So I would encourage you to sort of seek advice from those individuals at your institution and understand that they've done this hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times and can be there to answer your questions in terms of, hey, I don't want to get taken advantage of.
Yeah, that's great. And we just shared Matt and OUP's YouTube channel in the chat
Thank
below.
you.
I highly recommend you guys all check it out. That is how I met Matt myself, was seeing his YouTube videos. So yeah, highly recommend that. Our next question is, with such a high rate of failure in drug discovery and insurance and reimbursement with medical devices, what are the main positive signals you look for in biotech companies, excluding the team?
So well, I want to be clear. So the first part of that question was about medical device companies, but then you said biotech at the end. So is this question about medical device companies, med tech startups?
I think so. I
All
don't
right,
know.
I'm gonna
Oh, he
answer it
said both. The person who asked
both.
the
All
question
right,
said
let's
both.
start with med tech. All right, let's start with med tech. So very correct assumption that reimbursement, huge challenge in med tech companies. So med tech companies tend to get acquired far later in their development than biotech startups. So let's compare and contrast as well. So biotech companies often get acquired, sometime while they're in clinical studies. Maybe they show some clinical POC in humans. That's the frequent timing to get bought. Not true for med tech companies. Med tech companies often need to get FDA approval, do commercial launch, and scale revenue to 20, 30, 40, 50 plus $1 million in revenue before a large med tech company will acquire them. It's a totally different game. And oftentimes the management team needs to change in there because those are completely different skill sets, like developing a medical device and commercializing a medical device. So you often see management teams and CEOs change, which is normal. VCs who invest in medical devices tend to only invest once you have human clinical data that gets you really, really, really close to approval. If not, some VCs will only invest in a medical device after FDA approval because they just don't want to take the risk. They'll take the risk on the commercialization side, which includes, as part of the question, getting approval for reimbursement, Medicare codes for reimbursement, and then from there, that often flows to private payers reimbursing for a medical device. But you have to show a lot of real world evidence for your medical device to convince Medicare or private payers to cover, to pay for your medical device. So commercialization is really hard for medical devices. It's really, really challenging. So that's a huge pitfall that a lot of folks doing medical devices just don't realize is it's super hard to raise money. And so my number one piece of advice for academic med tech startups is do not form a startup. Do not do it early. Stay in the university as long as you possibly can. Get grants, do investigator-initiated trials, try to get some human clinical data before you ever form a company while staying at the university. And then once you have some human data, then start to think about, okay, can we form a company? Can we show this human data to investors? Often the first stop will be other surgeons, high net worth surgeons, and folks who believe in what you're doing in the data in the market. And then maybe later you can go raise money from institutional investors. But medtech's tough. Biotech's different. There's a much more robust ecosystem of investors, and we even saw from those slides on market, biopharma was by far the largest chunk. So you can raise money much sooner. The exit opportunities are much sooner. And people often think that like, oh, well, med tech, you don't need as much capital to get to an exit. It's just not true. Like you need a ton of money to commercialize a medical device. It takes a long time, if often longer. I think the cycles to get from uh, uh, inception to exit for a med tech company is longer than for a biotech company. So it's not easier. It really isn't. It's just different.
Great. And then this is our last question for today. Although actually we just hit 11, but do
That's
you have
okay. I can.
one more?
Yeah, I have spillover time. I have 15 minutes of spillover time.
Okay, amazing. Okay, so our last question for today is what is your opinion on the success of AI-based drug design and in silico screening startup in terms of one, getting funded or acquired, two, actual FDA approval, clinical success, or of lead drugs, aka do you think AI in drug discovery is hyped or a bubble?
Love the question. It's such a hot button issue. Um, Let me start by saying that, and I hate to disappoint anybody listening to the webinar, that I am not a tech bio investor. I do not put tech first. There are some investors out there that, say they're tech bio and they put tech first. Great. I'm not. So just understand that I'm coming at it from the lens of not being a tech bio investor. Tech is nice in support of drug discovery. It is not the reason for why drug discovery is successful. That is my personal take. People can argue with me. I get it. That's my lens. All right, now let me answer the question. AI for whether it's ligand discovery for small molecules, antibody design, in silico design, it is becoming a commoditized tool. Every pharma company has their own in-house technologies to do it today. You will not be acquired as a startup because you have better AI tools, period. End of story. They might partner with you if they think you have something unique, but they will 100% build it on their own. That is my personal belief. And that belief comes from talking to lots of pharma companies who are doing this in-house. They don't advertise it. You'll never know what they have. They won't tell you. But believe me, they have really, really smart people and way more resources than you have to be able to build this in-house. Okay. That's key to understand. And you always need to understand that just because pharma hasn't said they're doing it doesn't mean they're not doing it. That said, there are always new approaches and new technologies that are different and unique. So how do you leverage those to make medicines that actually are unique, right? Can you go after targets that other people haven't been able to unlock? That's critical. Just today, Flagship announced a new company, doing small molecule ligand design, and they were very clear in their press release. We're not going to make better versions of drugs that we already have, against targets we already have ligands for. We're going to go after things we don't have any ligands for, and we're going to try to do something hard that you can't do any other way. That makes sense to me. Like I totally believe that might be true. Um, but from an investor standpoint, it's very hard for me to figure out like who's doing something better than someone else when it comes to using AI to do small molecule discovery. I think there are a few companies that have a little bit more sort of proof in the pudding. Um, I don't want to name names because I don't want to call anyone out, but there's a couple companies that have, for example, I know of one that just presented data at ESMO last week, where they took from, I think, design and of the molecule to human clinical data 2 years, which is incredible. I mean, that's incredibly fast. From my perspective and my team's perspective, we don't love that program. We're not sure how competitive it's going to be in the market, but at least they were able to take something from discovery to clinical data in 2 years. I mean, that's super fast. So that's good. But if you make the wrong choices on target, is anyone going to care? Some investors, and you can keep the wheel going, but eventually the music will stop. You have to make medicines that people care about. Otherwise, what's the point? Um, and I'd be remiss to say that where I think AI can have an even greater impact is on clinical development. I think clinical development, regulatory, commercial, I mean, the opportunity for AI to disrupt those spaces to me is so much greater. And frankly, like finding ligands, doing that discovery, that's cheap. That's cheap, easy. That's not the real issue. The hard part is, clinical. Oh my gosh, like that's the hard part. That's the part that takes a long time. That's really expensive. And that's where if we could cut the rate of failure, you'd have real impact on the industry.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Matt. That was a wonderful presentation, and we really appreciate you taking the time to
Yeah, my
speak with all
pleasure.
of us.
Oh, happy to do it, and thanks for having me.
Thank you. And this will be uploaded on YouTube if you guys want to go back and check out any of the insights that Matt gave us.
Great.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.